group that I helped start up.
Well, we are looking forward to yours here.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you.
So I am Josh Buettner. A little bit of background about me. I grew up in a family of 5. I was the oldest we've got 4 brothers and the baby sister. She's the youngest. My dad grew up in a family of 10, and he was the 5th kid. So everything for my dad was equal portion. So if I got a bolt-action rifle, my 3 brothers got the exact same bolt-action. And so there was 20%, 20%, 20%. Whatever I got, all my siblings got. And then right before I graduated high school, I joined the Army National Guard. And so the Army, consistency across the board. I spent 17 years dress right dress, and so that's making sure everything is tidy and looks exactly identical to the next guy. So when I retired from the Army a little over 5 years ago, I needed something to do with my hands. I had emergency back surgery, and we had just moved, so I had a lot of time to forward and backwards, twiddle my thumbs, and that didn't last long. So then Beth and I started doing wood and epoxy cribbage boards. And then 5 years ago, this next month, February of 20, I got my first lathe. I got right here at Woodcraft a little Rikon 7100 12 by 16 pen lathe that I've never turned a pen on. And I have maxed it out on length and width on that piece more than one time. So as a turner, I have always gravitated towards live edge. I spent my entire childhood, everything being identical to my siblings, and then the next 17 years of my life trying to make everything identical to the next person, the next soldier. And so any type of turning to where it is erratic and you have that live edge, I naturally gravitate to as far as aesthetics. And so I do like doing a nice round piece, but I do like live edge because it brings that natural beauty that God put there in the wood with our fine, refined, turned finish. And so that's what I'm doing today. So in February of 23, there was an online wood turning symposium, and one of the demonstrators was Paul Russell from Utah, and he has his entire series of Barely There. And so my wife and I, we've decided we're going to start calling these bent branch bud vases because I don't want to take away from what Paul has built up for himself. But like any time, I tend to kind of zone out on a demonstration, and I didn't focus on the nitpicky intricacies on turning this. So my first couple ones were very rough. But after that, watching that demonstration, I closed my laptop and I looked out our kitchen window to our wood pile, and there was a cottonwood log, and it was twisted and contorted and dried, and I went out there and grabbed that piece, and 2-3 months later, that was my first piece like this. So what you're doing is you're taking any kind of bent branch. So this one's about a 3-inch diameter. I've got, and I'll start passing them around, I have this large honey locust. So this one was turned green, and inevitably it cracked on the bottom because it took about 5 months to dry. And so I'll start. It is heavy. So turn that one. Honey locust is a great wood for keeping the bark on because it's almost impossible to get it off. This piece, so Chris had asked if this was my first demo. I have done several demos. My wife and I, along with one of the owners of a lumber store up in Cheyenne, we've put together a Cheyenne Makers Meet. And so knowing that I was going to be doing this demo today, I did this piece back in October. This is some elm. This one was turned green as well. And so on this one, it doesn't have the bark off. As a rule of thumb for me, if the bark's coming off, I take it off. I get rid of it. If there's any thought that it's going to come off, I remove it before even putting it on the lathe. I've got 2 marks up in the insulation on the wall in our shop as proof that if it's coming off, take it off.
I'm glad to hear those marks aren't on your body.
Yeah, tell me about it. This one is some staghorn sumac, real pretty wood, real nice. Green or yellow and brown alternating grain patterns along with the very white sapwood. And so this is another one that the bark stays on pretty well. So this Russian olive that Bob critiqued, this one is by far my favorite piece. I have my best friend over in Greeley. He does tree removal. He's always grabbing wonky stuff like this and storing it for me. And he gave this to me early last year and said, I don't know what you're going to be able to do with it, but I know you're going to be able to do something cool. And in my mind, it's like, yep, I'm doing a bent branch bud vase, and it's your Christmas present. And so last Saturday, I was doing some errands down here in Colorado, so I ran over to Greeley and snagged this one from him. Like I said, that one is my favorite one that I have done. So I did that elm piece back in October, and it was good for me to get an idea of time frame. That one took me about 3 hours, so had to find a smaller diameter piece to work with. So this one's right at about 2 by 3 diameter. This is black walnut, and I had this marked out yesterday. And so I took it to the bandsaw and I chopped it off, and I turned this piece this morning. So if I mess this one up, there's going to be some smoke and mirrors, and oh look, here's our finished product. Probably shouldn't have said that. But the piece I did yesterday was some really wet apple, and I put it on the lathe and I just spun it and I turned it, and then it's like, wait a sec, I didn't go through anything in my head. I didn't walk anything through it. So this was my dry run this morning. So it still needs, I've got to burn my name and species. This is black walnut, and so this is the top of the piece that you guys are going to see today. All right, so to start off with, you want to get the curvature isolated on where you're going to be turning at, and then so I use spur drive at the top, and I just do it between centers, and then because of time constraints, I went ahead and I turned a tenon on this today. It's the only thing I did. One thing I do want to point out, so on these, it's really good thing to go from pith to pith. On this one, my indexing point is slightly offset from where the pith is, and that's because the tenon is going to go away, and I'm actually going to be taking probably about a 1/2 inch off the top of this. And so if you go 1/2 inch up and you look left and right, that pith should be pretty well close to the center. And so you want to plan accordingly for that. And so I just take my yardstick and I line it up and I get a good idea. This piece curves at the top, and so the pith is off. So it's a rule of thumb, but it's not a hard and fast rule. The main point is being able to have enough material at the top to have the flute of your bud vase and to be able to stand this upright and have it balance. And so when I cut it on the bandsaw, it balanced. And so that's a good sign right off the bat, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to start. So chucking it up between your centers and then getting a tenon cut. That's what I've done already this morning. So we are going to go ahead and we're going to get this thing mounted, and we're going to start turning. So on this one, I already did the pre-run this morning, so the bark stayed on. So this was harvested winter time, because when you harvest wood during the summertime, the bark is loose, it's growing, it'll slough off. So this one, we should be good to go. Want to talk about tools real quick. So this is a branch. This is in spindle orientation. So my main tool that I use is a spindle gouge. But when we are turning spindles, what's the one tool that we typically grab to rough this out? Spindle roughing gouge. Thank you. The problem with a spindle roughing gouge, it's good for spindle turning. It's not good for end grain turning because the tang on that is so thin, and if we were to try it with this, it's going to catch on this grain very likely, and it's going to bend that tool. So on this turning, I've done my first several pieces were with Easy Wood Tool carbide tools, both the square and the round. I've used straight bowl gouge on these, and just as of several months ago, using the spindle gouge. The one tool I absolutely will not touch on this style of turning is that spindle roughing gouge.
So I just want to second that, Josh. Spindle roughing gouge is for relatively regular spindle work.
Straight grain.
And do not use it for anything else unless you want to risk spearing yourself through and through when that tang breaks off and that weapon comes flying at you. So it used improperly is the most dangerous tool in your shop. Used properly works wonderful and removes the material really quickly. So
yeah, if you go over here and you grab, some square stock in spindle orientation, you want to get that round, the roughing gouge is perfect tool. And a lot of times when you have this bend in the branch, is typically because of a knot, and that's exactly what we've got here. We've got knots expressed throughout. Do not, I cannot stress enough, please do not use a spindle roughing gouge. But we're going to go ahead and start. Yes, sir.
Did you say that you had used index cutters on some of this?
I've used carbide cutters.
And that worked?
Yes. So, my wife and I, on our Instagram page, we had just hit 900 followers, and then I posted a video of a cottonwood with using my square carbides. We had just got our shop, and prior to that we were in our one stall garage, so I don't have space for my bench grinder. So to sharpen a carbide, loosen it, rotate it 90 degrees, and you're back up and running. I caught so much flack on that video, but that video got 60 million views, well over 300 comments, a lot of which are deleted, and just completely inappropriate tools. You can use a carbide, and the thing is, there's always a best tool for a task. This one, spindle gouge, is a perfect tool, but you can use a bowl gouge. I've done several of these with just a bowl gouge. It takes quite a bit more time, and I've used those carbide tools. The only one tool I will say not to use is the roughing gouge. But yes, that first one I did was cottonwood. I hadn't gotten into the traditional tools yet and knew what I was doing, so I went with my carbides, and it worked nicely. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to advance our quill and get this going, and we're going to start spinning. So these are condition-based speeds. So this is a very unbalanced piece. Start off as low as you can and work your speeds up. And so I was at running between about 400 and 600 today. Yep. Had to adjust the leg. We're good. So we're going to just speed it up So I'm at about 375, and I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So the process that I do with these, I typically work on truing up the flute first. So we're just going to start with that. Yep.
So Josh, if you had a really big offset, would you work on trimming that offset first?
Chris, thank you for asking that. Yes. So on several pieces, if you have it, it's a good idea to take it to the bandsaw and put it on a diet plan, and get rid of that material. I've done that on several pieces. This piece, with as small as this piece is, to show the steps from start to finish, I didn't feel it was necessary, because we're going to get rid of, you know, I could take maybe a 3/4 of an inch off this lump right here. But yes, use whatever tool you have at your disposal to get rid of that. So taking a cut and removing this top portion, absolutely, by all means, go for it. Good question, Chris. Thank you.
Is there a reason why your quill is so far extended?
So I've got it extended just because I'm going to be swapping out. I'm going to be putting my drill chuck in there later. So for ease of setting it and forgetting it, I'm just leaving it there. But yes, if I wanted to mess with it, I could get it, my tailstock brought up, get the quill compacted in. So I'm going to be using my drill chuck later to bore a hole in there. So that's why I've got it a little bit further out. All right, so we're just going to start making some shaping cuts. Okay, that's off. Tighten up the tool rest so it doesn't move on me. So I like starting these with the top first. The piece I turned yesterday, I just put my earbuds in and just went to town, because this is interrupted cuts. We've all turned interrupted cuts at some point, whether you've got a square stock that you're working with and don't have a bandsaw to get rid of the corners on that. So that tick, 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 get used to it. We're probably going to be cutting maybe 15-20% if you wanted to figure out the amount of contact with your chisel compared to the overall diameter, if you wanted to math it out. It's a very slow, tedious process doing these, just for the simple fact that you have those interrupted cuts and you're off balance. You can't really go too fast, otherwise it's going to be off balance and it's going to create a hazard condition. I got up to 600 with the one I did this morning, and once you get material relieved, you start to balance it. That center of gravity goes towards the center. Get rid of some of that stuff. Bark's coming off a little bit. So we're just going to keep plugging and chugging. Patrick, I'm sorry if anything flies at you. So another reason I like to start at the top is to get an idea of how big that overall flute or bowl portion of the vase is going to be. So we're looking at this. It's going to be a little bit more down, skinnier than this. And so I'm going to start working here. So that way I can hopefully speed this up a little bit more, make things go a little bit faster for us.
How many times has he sent you off to the hospital?
Zero. So, as far as woodworking goes, I do have a good scar right here on the web of my thumb from back in high school. I cut myself with a wood chisel. I was in woods class and I had my rails for my futon glued together, and so glue scraper wasn't working because I had excessive amount. So I was going, and next thing I know, I felt a trickle of blood. Didn't feel the cut, went right through nerves. It's always the hand tools that get me. It's never when I'm working with a power tool. So we're just going to try and get some shaping cuts out of the way. Yep, we're losing a bunch. A lot more bark than we did earlier. So let's see if we can't pop this off. I know. At this point, now I'm going to slice my finger open. So we're going to have to do this periodically throughout just to try and get rid of it. The other one, the bark stayed fine on it. It literally was at the top of that. So a lot of ghost cuts, a lot of interrupted cuts. The real trick to this is just a steady hand. And patience, lots of patience. A lot of just rough cuts. It's going to look really rough, and that's fine because we're going to still be relieving a lot of material. So another thing that I like to do early on is I try to plan accordingly for how much is going to be waste on this, and then I try to kind of eyeball where I want that bottom curve to be, because we're going to follow the curvature of the branch itself, and then we're going to kick out. And so we're going to go probably about here. So I'm just going to put a cut in here just so that way I have an index point to where I don't go past that. As much noise as I'm making, you guys definitely can understand why throwing some earbuds or earmuffs on and listening to some music comes into play. Out of all the demos, this is probably going to be the loudest one this year. So you see that I'm bouncing back and forth on both sides of the middle of the bend. The reason being that you want to do that is because you don't want to get it too thin up here and then have to work down here and then end up having it compressed like a spring and then break on you. So going back and forth is a good idea to keep in mind. You want to kind of relieve the material equally on both up and below your curvature that you've got going. And we're going to see if we can just... So we're at 470 right now, so a little bit faster. And ultimately, nice cleaner cut. So I'm working right here towards the bottom, trying to get that curvature going. Start forming that. And the beauty about these, you're following the tree's growth as your form. So a bunch of the design is already done for us with these pieces. Like I said, it's a very slow and tedious turning piece. But ultimately, it is a very nice and refined piece towards the end.
So Josh,
Yes, sir.
you haven't brought your tool rest in closer. You can do that now that you've...
Yeah,
quite
I
a bit,
can,
right?
and I...
Yeah, because that way, you know, especially with a spindle gouge that's a little lighter, you're not going to get as much flex.
Yeah, I actually wish I would have kept that top portion for the demo, because that was a lot easier turning this morning. But I guess what's a good demo without something going wrong, right? And we're going to try and turn this up just a little bit. Nope. It's looking like 500 is all we're going to be getting for now. So all of the techniques you employ when you're doing a spindle turning come into play here. The only difference is this has that imbalance, that off, or the ghost cuts, the interrupted cuts. Adjusting that. I'm going to work on this top for a moment. Try and get that nice and round. So you can do this with green or with dried wood. This has been dried for quite some time. There's a trade-off with using green wood versus dried wood and vice versa. Green wood, you run the risk of it cracking as it's drying. Dry wood, as we're seeing right now, this thing is splintering quite a bit. The advantage to dry is that I can take this and I can finish it and get it lacquered up almost within a day or so. Whereas green wood, you've got to play that waiting game. Yes, sir.
For this roughing out portion, have you experimented at all with using spindle gouges with steeper grind?
I have not. I've got the question was, have I experimented with the different grind? I have not. I've got this 5/8 spindle gouge, and then I've got my 3/8 detail gouge from Trent, and they both have the same grind on it. And yes, that if I had an additional spindle gouge to where I can play with that and find out what works better on these, then I would do that. But with having this and my detail gouge is the only two, I keep them at the same angle that I've got them. Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment on why you prefer a spindle gouge over a bowl gouge for what you're doing?
Yeah, good question. So why would I prefer spindle gouge over a bowl gouge? So with a bowl gouge, and I can do a little bit to show you, the spindle gouge is at such a steep angle, you can get in there and kind of go nice and easily and get that as a real fine, nice cut. With the bowl gouge, the bowl gouge, we've got our grind that we're going on, and we're having to ride that bevel. And without having a nice, consistent turning surface for the bevel, you almost want to start with a bowl gouge being open and then slowly rotate it closed in the direction of your travel. But I can go ahead and show you on this. And so the problem is I can't get near as much of a bite as you can, and you're having to typically stay in an open position as you're advancing your tool. What's that? It is a spindle. It is. And so we have the grain orientation working against us. You know, the spindle is designed for spindle work. There are things with a bowl gouge like this top I can get in here and I can take a cut and clean this top up later, which is what I'm going to do. But it's a spindle turning, and it is an intricate spindle turning because of that bent and having all that interrupted cut. So good question, Jenny, but the biggest thing is riding that bevel because you have so little material to actually ride along. And the spindle gouge, with it having that steep cutting angle, it tends to work a little better. You can use a bowl gouge, and like I said, you're going to want to start with that being in an open position, and then you're not going to get much of a closed position, but you definitely want to roll it in that direction and travel whichever way you're going. It is possible. I've done it, and it's a slower process, though. What's that? Corey, I just got a skew from Merrill, and I've used it at Yen's class about 1.5 years ago. And the skew is one of those tools that scares me. And so I will definitely try it on spindle work that is not interrupted cuts. Alex, yes, ma'am. Learning the skew on a big fat carrot, yes. You've got a relatively easy media that you're working with. And last year before the symposium, Rudy, I believe, and quite a few others, I know Jean-Francois was using turning carrots and potatoes. And yes, practice with any tool. It comes down to practice and get familiar with it. And I am not familiar with the skew. Say that again? Yeah. I've got a cast iron lathe bed, and so it's a little different when you're running a robust American Beauty, that stainless steel, up at Trent Bosch's, because then you don't have to worry near as much. But yeah, turning green wood is, you need to get your lathe cleaned up, otherwise you're going to get some surface rust going. And we've all had those times where we're turning green wood, and even just finishing a project is a little bit too much. And then you get the WD-40 and give it a good wipe down and polish it up again. All right. So we're still doing good on time. What's that? This morning I didn't sharpen it, but initially, and so this, I put a fresh grind on it. And so, you know, that's one of those things where when you're starting to have a difficulty turning, you know, by all means go ahead and sharpen it. But I've got quite a bit of a burr still on my chisel. Whatever reason, this piece is just not doing as well as the one I did this morning. And it's because I'm in front of an audience. So the comment was, looks like we're getting close to hit this side branch. So let's go ahead and actually look at it. So it looks, looking through it up close, it looks like I might have another ½ inch or so worth of material before I start to worry about this little kicker. But we are doing good as far as our thickness. We need to work a little bit more down here, and then we need to work up here, finish the flute of our vase. But yeah, so I'm gonna isolate right here, turn this down a little bit, and so it is very rough. And then we're gonna start going through the cleanup process on these. We're going to go and we're going to take a little bit of material, but the goal is to completely miss that little kicker completely. Yep. The front row's they're getting their money's worth today. It's a souvenir for you. So you look, I've got a pretty good, so I'm a little bit thinner right here than I am down here. And so on this curvature here, I like using my bowl gouge because it allows me to get in, because I am using it in the open position, and then I can come in here and I can work that curve. So I'm going to leave this for a moment, but I am going to grab the bowl gouge. I'm going to clean this top up a little bit, then we'll work here. And so, as I was saying, I can get my gouge in here, and because of it being rounded in here, I can get a nice curvature going on with that. So that is what we're going to be working on. Trying to get this as a nice defined curve down here towards the bottom of this vase. Steady hands is an absolute must for this turning. That was 40. I got 40 more. I'm sitting at 540 right now. So right now I'm just cleaning up this surface a little bit.
Start at 7:30 because that's when the sleep meeting happens.
So I'm just cleaning up this surface a little bit with this gouge. All right. So I got a little bit in here I want to work on. So I'm uneven at the top, so we're going to flatten that, and then we're going to start focusing on the flute of this piece. We're going and putting a flare on this because it's a bud vase. We should have a nice flare at the top. Some of my piece, so 4 out of the 5 pieces up here flare, well, 3 out of the 5 pieces flare out at the top. 2 of them are just kind of rounded over. So as far as my little bit of aesthetic that I put into these pieces, I tend to kind of have a little bit of a bulge here at the bottom of where that is going to be hollowed out to. It's just an aesthetic choice for me. This one we are running out of room on, as far as we don't have that material right there to put a little bulge or a bead-ish aesthetic on it. So we're just going to go ahead, we're going to taper that in, and then we're just going to keep going. So any kind of styling that you folks do on any of your other turned work is going to come in play here. We all have our own aesthetic choices that we put into our turned pieces, so employ that in here. So Jenny, as far as your question earlier about using the bowl gouge over the spindle gouge, you can, and I like using it at the end because it does give a little bit cleaner of a surface, but it is definitely a lengthier time because you're not being able to remove that much material as you are with a spindle gouge. Okay, so I like how the top of that is looking. A little bit of tear out we will get cleaned up. And then I have a lump right in here. So I've got to work on that transition. I've got another lump here. So I've got between these, my fingers, I've got cleaning up I need to do quite a bit. So we're going to get that. We're going to work on that little bit of area. This amount of tool marks is acceptable for this because a lot of the finishing is sanding on this, and because we're talking percentage of a vessel that was solid, it's such a small amount of sanding. So this is one of the advantages to a turning piece like this. Yes, sir. So Good question. So on typically this, I can use either my 2-inch die grinder with discs and run it up the gamut from 80 to 320 or wherever I'm going. Also, an orbital sander is going to be ideal if you don't have a 2-inch die grinder, because you get a lot of that large surface, and it's just a nice gradual surface to where you can get in there and you can use an orbital and you can kind of rock back while on the lathe without having the lathe running.
Running at the end, but not in the middle. Is that correct?
Say that again?
So when you're standing at the smaller end, you're
So,
running the lathe.
yes.
When you're standing at the rest, you're just standing static.
Yes, on this, we've got about a 2.5 maybe portion where we are completely round. So I will turn and sand that while the lathe is running, whereas this flat, you can try it, it's not going to work. I can tell you that from experience, folks. So rocking it back and forth will get that continuous curve that you are looking for. And then down here, there is a special tool that I use down here. So me being in the Army, I am a big gun guy, and I can't leave anything standard. I have to modify it somehow. So just about all of my Glock pistols that I have, I stipple. So I wood burn. And a couple years ago, I got a sanding bit, and it's a 1/8 shank, and then it's got 2 different sizes on it. I've got it here, and when we get to that point, I'll pass it around so you guys can see it. But those 2 pieces I had that I bought from a gun company were made out of aluminum, and aluminum sanding pieces in a Dremel don't work worth a dang. The current piece I have, I had the machinist at the flight facility, where I worked at as tech supply, make one out of a tail rotor bolt. So when we get to what's that? Yeah, I'm not going to be able to snap that one. I mean, you're talking the highest grade of metal. And so on that note, we all know a machinist, tool manufacturer, turner, and teacher, and I've been talking to him about it. And he's got the dimensions and everything, and hopefully he brings that to the commercial market. So it's on here, and basically it allows you to take any size or grit sanding paper and to be able to electrical tape them. And when I pass this around, I'll unwind it. You'll be able to see how it works. But this is nice because when you're talking about a Dremel and sanding, for this area, you're going to have to use a drum of some kind. But when we have the factory drums, we get 2 grits, a coarse and a medium. And then you have 2 sizes. You have the skinny and then the larger diameter. This, you can use any sandpaper, whether you want to use a full sheet and cut it down. I use quarter sheets because we originally had quarter sheet sandpaper, and I've got packs out yep, you know where. And so this allows me to get into this corner. And so when we get to that point, I'll be running this and be able to show you. But yeah, we are getting very close to where we're going to stop. Oh, thanks.
So, Josh, I don't know if this is the right time to ask, but have you considered, you've got a beautiful curve this way on there, but you also have the opportunity to maybe take that base and go in the other axis and do an offset turning as well to get even some additional interesting curvature on it. Have you considered that at all?
Are you talking about coming here and coming backwards on it?
No, taking that to do offset turning on the lathe. So on the base, rather than being right in the center, run it. You know,
Okay, a multi-axis to where I'm kicking this out.
because you've got such a nice axis on the curve, you could perhaps do 190 degrees and get a really interesting side curve on that too.
You possibly could. I have not attempted it. I've done some multi-axis turning, and with this being as wonky, which is a great term, with this being as wonky as it is, I don't want to bother trying to kick this.
I
And
don't want you to do it tonight. That's
no,
for sure,
I'm
but-
not trying anything tonight. So one thing that you'll notice on the majority of my pieces, I have nice turned all wood without live edge, and then I have half and half turned, half live edge, and then I like to finish the bottoms off where it's completely encapsulated by live edge, whether I can retain the bark or if it has to go, that live edge. And so that's how I do my pieces. I come in, I go nice and straight, I taper it, I do get that curve put in there, and I do this kick out curve at the bottom. And also what that does is that adds counterbalance to your piece, because I have full faith and confidence in it. When I park this off, we're going to be fine, and it's not going to move back and forth. But having this mass back here is a good counterbalance to keep it upright so it doesn't wobble off. Because the last thing we want to do is we want to make a bud vase for someone, whether a gift or to sell, and then it not stand upright with the slightest jostle back and forth. So we're going to get back. We're going to focus on the top portion of this curve, and then we're going to get into the finishing aspect. And so it's 7:45. We are doing good on time. So we're going to start down here in the center. So right now with the bowl gouge, I am probably at a 45 degree in the direction of travel. And I'm not going very fast with my tool. So, like I said, I'm at about a 45 degree with my gouge. Just going nice and slow because the spindle speed on the lathe is slow. We're under 600. And so most of the time when you're talking about spindle speeds, you're well past 4 digits. So I'm just doing a pull cut ever so gently just to clean up my lines the best I can while we're spinning and using the best tool for the job. Because once you sand by hand, you're going out of round. Which, with this piece, no one is going to know the difference. But it's always easy to use the best tool for the job. Starting to transition from a pull cut to a push cut. And so you can see the surface is a lot cleaner, but it is a lot more of a time frame. So I'm going to get this transition point cleaned up, and then we're going to touch up here a little bit, and then we're going to keep moving along. So the nice thing about this is I've got that faintly purple heartwood showing through, really contrasted by the bright sapwood of the black walnut. Really pretty wood to work with. So we're going to pick up on this transition point. got some irregular cuts right here down at this bottom groove, so I'm gonna just nice and easily clean it up. All right. Okay, I've got a little bit of irregular going on up top, so we're gonna pick up a cut. Nice and slow and delicate. Transition that. All right. Now we're starting to look a little bit more like a finished product. Still a long ways to go, but that's fine. So I do have my negative rake scraper, and it is a good tool to employ. This one is a robust. It's their 1 1/8, 1 1/4, I believe. And so what's nice about this, using this negative rake scraper, is that it has a really wide tool width. So I can get here and I can apply a lot of downward pressure with the tool onto the tool rest and do a lot better job keeping it where it's at versus the spindle gouge where it's doing a lot of bouncing. So I'm going to make a pass or two with the negative rake scraper. This one's a robust. It's in my Thompson handle. So the tool is a robust, yes. Yep, it's a Thompson handle. It's a robust negative rake scraper. So out of all the different scrapers I was looking at, I wanted a good wide thick tool, and I wanted to be able to have a good portion of the tang have that curve on it, so that way I can glide along. And I wanted it to be slightly round nose, to where if I need to get in and use this far side, I was able to.
What is the material?
M42. Yeah. So I like the Thompson handles. I was looking back and forth between Robust, Thompson, Carter & Sons, a couple other manufacturers out there. And then as far as the specs for a negative rake scraper, Robust had my requirements.
Have you tried any of Thompson's 10V scrapers?
I have not tried any of the Thompson scrapers. So I've got their...
Might want to give them a try. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
The steel is hardened to about... Thompson steel is 10V, but it's hardened to about Rockwell 61, 62.
Okay.
It has a high vanadium carbide content, which makes it very tough and abrasion resistant. M42, on the other hand, is typically hardened to the high 60s Rockwell, which
Right.
makes it much more difficult to grind, and it lacks the carbides that the Thompson tools have. So Thompson will give you the best of both worlds. It'll give you excellent abrasion resistance with easy grindability. The M42 typically doesn't have that.
Gotcha. Because my spindle gouge is a Thompson. My 5/8 V bowl gouge is a Thompson, and I like them. Very good tools. And so I don't have any of their scrapers, but I will definitely see if I can't find someone who's got one of those. Rick, you've got a Thompson, don't you?
You can borrow mine anytime.
Yep. So, and that's the beauty about this club. We've got people that have certain things, and you can, hey, can I try it out? And then, exactly. I tend to be a buy once, cry once, but if you don't know what you want, you end up buying multiple times. So, just going nice and easy on this. Just cleaning up the edge trying to work and get rid of the tool marks to help minimize any of the sanding. Once again, it is a slow, tedious process, but that's the beauty about wood turning. You can just lose yourself in a piece and it centers you. At least it does for me. One of the best things about turning for me, it helps with my PTSD that I have. And so I'm able to work on a piece and completely lose myself, just put some tunes on and just turn away. And my wife Beth can attest, if I am away from my lathe anything longer than a day or so, I get really cranky and she has to put up with me, unfortunately. But being medically retired from the Army, this is what I get to do on a day-to-day basis. So, I am so happy that I've been able to find an outlet that is as productive as this. All right, we're going to stop this. We're going to move my tool rest. Yep, and so I don't know if you can pick up on it, but we've removed a bunch of the tool marks. All right. So as wood turners, we're always told to look at the opposite side instead of at our tool. I was in an explosion, unrelated to the military, 13 years ago. So I've got scar tissue behind the retina in my right eye. So one, depth perception is a pain for me. So if I'm doing very delicate work, I will often look at my tool instead of on the other side. It strains my neck, but I keep my chiropractor in business. And that's only during delicate cuts that I'm doing that with. All right. So one easy place to really have issues with is right here, because you are cutting into that end grain. And that's looking a lot better than the rest of my vase that I've got going. So doing something right. All right. Yeah, we're okay on that. So we're going to work on the actual flute of the vase. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tighten up my chuck one more time because I'm going to be taking the tailstock off. And so all right, we're going to get this quill moved down and out of the way. And then clear off the chips so I can move my tool rest. All right. So I'm going to use my bowl gouge, and so spindle turning, we want to turn inside out when we are working on the opening. So I'm going to back this tool rest off. All right. Make sure we're not going to hit anything, and then we're going to spin it. So it's a little bit out of center, and you know that's from the chuck being in place, and we're going with our tailstock and our live center. We're going into the hole that I had when I had my drive spur in that, and so the drive spur gets that hole wonky, wallered out a little bit. So the off center that we're going, very imperceptible. And so we're just going to clean this up. And actually I'm going to grab my spindle gouge for this. Because what we want to do is we want to match that flare on the outside to the inside. And so on this, we've got maybe about 1.5 inches to where we're going to be able to bore our hole down there. On the one I did earlier today, because of the amount of material that I've got to where this is all good wood, I was able to get the bowl portion wallered out quite a bit. On this one, we're looking at, we've probably got about 2 1/4, 2 1/2 is probably going to be pushing out, because we don't want to use our Forstner bit to bore a hole, and we don't want to pop out along your live edge and ruin your piece. So we're going to clean this up a little bit more, and we're going to have that flare be very minimal. If we have more material to where we could bore that hole into, I would say put your taper in quite a bit more. And we're going to try do a cut along the face. The challenge with doing a facing cut like that while having the tailstock removed is you've got that oscillation back and forth, and depending on how good your tenon is cut, you get that wobbling back and forth. The advantage is you're not going to hit your live center with your tool. So pick the easier of the battles. All right, we're going to stop. So I have a little bit more I should clean up. And yeah. So we're going to try and just nice and easily what we're doing is we're trying to get rid of any of the tear out that's on top that's left from the spur drive that I used. And so we've got a little bit here on the side, so I'm going to get that, I'm going to take this collar down, this flare down when I'm back attached with my tailstock in place. And try and taper it down. Just a little bit more. All right. So I'm going to put my tailstock back in place, and I'm going to clean up that shoulder with my scraper. This is so much easier when you're in your own shop and you've got your air chuck right next to you to blow everything. So we're just going to get close up to that. We're going to start turning it before we advance the quill. And all right, turn the lathe off. We're going to get this back close to it. And then I've got a little bit of tear out and chipping right there that I want to clean up. So just nice and easy. I'm not trying to remove a whole bunch of material. I'm just trying to clean it. But because we went and took the tailstock off and we're out of round, I'm just going to do a quick short pass. Just to get it cleaned up. And the advantage is I only have to go to where that whole round stops at, right in about here. All right, we're going to stop it. Tiniest little bit, I'm going to touch that shoulder just one more time. Yep, that'll work. Tiny little bit left, but we're going to get that with sanding. So I am going to get my drill chuck in here and we're going to bore a hole. So I've got two different sizes. I got 5/8 and 3/4 that I brought with. And so we're going to have my little 6-inch ruler, and I keep it dummy corded to my lathe so that way I can't put it in my pocket and walk off with it. And it is hard to find a 6-inch ruler with metric on the bottom because, let's face it, wood turning, it's so much easier to work in metric. Everything's in tens. And so I keep it dummy corded on my lathe because I will walk away with that. I've done it. I still have the first one from my first lathe. Even though I haven't touched it, it's there. So at our skinniest, we're at about 1.25 inches. We can talk standard, talking this because we're talking gross measurements. And then we're gonna go 2.25 at the absolute max on that. So we're gonna pop that tailstock out. We're gonna slide this back. We're going to get the tool rest and banjo moved out of the way for the moment because we are boring. All right. And let's see. I think this is the 5/8 one in here, but I'm going to verify. Nope, I have the 3/4. So I know it is state of the art. I need to get a chisel bag so I can put all my chisels in there. And instead of having them rolling around on the floorboards, quick ran into the back of my car. So we get stuff from Amazon, Chewy, all other places shipped in all the time, and getting the recycle taken every 2 weeks just doesn't cut it. So when we have our cardboard, I have the kids take it and put it into the back of my car because I take it to the recycling facility on base. So I do that every 3, 4, 5 weeks, depending on how much stuff we get into it. So I'm going to go about 2 1/4. And so the 2 1/4 ends up being right here at the top of this little recess. And so that's going to be our gauge. Also, we can verify on the quill as we're advancing it how far we want to go in. So I'm going to get that seated as best as possible. We're going to shift the tool stock, or the tail stock, sorry. And we're going to get that close without touching. And then, so the Forstner bits, the Wood River, I've got the whole like 30-piece set that they sell here. Awesome. It's somewhere in a ballpark of 450-ish for the larger bits, and this one is the RPM speed they recommend on these ones. Max of 870. We're well under that, so we don't even have to worry about adjusting the speed. So we're just going to start going nice and easy. What's that?
That speed isn't end to end range.
Nope. So just nice and easy. Go in a little bit. Blow off the dust chips. Go another short distance. Pull it out. Blow it off. Once again, having this in your own shop where you've got your air chuck right there to blow it off is so much more nice, but we're going to do what we can. And we're going to get one more pass at it. That'll do it. And we're going to call that, folks. Okay, turn that off. Get rid of this. Drill chuck, move the tailstock back out of the way. Get the chips removed the best we can. All right, so when I went in at a taper, it wasn't much of a taper at all, and so I got a very sharp angle right there inside of that. So we're going to adjust the tailstock out of the way, and I'm going to get another tool out to utilize. I'm going to be using my 3/8 detail gouge from Trent Bosch, and so what I'm going to be doing on this, I am basically just getting in there and I'm doing a scraping cut coming out. And so 5/8 hole, 5/8 gouge, not going to work too well. So we're just going to get this sharp angle right here knocked down is all we're going to be doing real quick. And so I can get in there a little bit and clean it up. And then just work that angle. And then we're just doing a shear scrape and cut, pulling out on that, because I'm not riding against the bevel or anything. I'm getting it at that 90 degree to that left wing. And so, because all we're doing is we're just breaking that shoulder down right here. And so we've got it. I've got a little bit of chatter going on the inside, which is not a big deal, because we are at that point where, well, I'm going to clean that up a little bit with the scraper tool. But we're going to talk about sanding for a moment, because we are at a good spot. I've got a couple areas I need to address with the scraper just to make sanding a little bit easier. So as I was talking about, I have my Dremel, and the problem with Dremel is you have minimal options for good sanding. So the drums are the most commonplace to use. But as I mentioned earlier, the problem with your drums, you've got 2 sizes and 2 grits. And so that doesn't do us much good, especially if we want to do sanding with anything that's nice and refined. And so on this, like I said, I'm going to pass this around when I'm done. This is a custom bit, and I've talked to Trent Bosch about it, and so hopefully he brings this to the market, because it is such a useful little sanding bit. The closest thing I've seen to this is where you have the long drum and it's got a recess in it, and you have to cut your sandpaper meticulously to length, because it comes and wraps around and it recesses in there. And so this, I mean, you can't get much better than wrapping whatever grit and size sandpaper around a metal drum. So we're just going to go in here. We're going to slow this down. We're going to turn at the same time, and we're going to get this in here. And so the advantage of having this specific bit, which I'm going to move the tailstock further out of the way. So with this bit and this sandpaper, I can get into there and I can get as much of that wall, because even with the best Forstner bit, the best drill bit, whatever you're working with, you're still going to have some inconsistencies, some tear out and whatnot. So sanding it up, it's one of those things where as a wood turner, you and I, we're going to take a piece, we're going to stick our fingers in it, and we're going to feel how good it is. Anybody else, they're not going to bat an eye. They're going to be like, oh, that is so awesome and that's so pretty. But because this is for a bunch of wood turners, I'm going to make sure and I get this as sanded nice and neat as I can. So have you ever seen a drum be able to do something this? And so the answer is probably no. So we're going to spin that up a little bit. And then that's pretty dang good. And so this is a demonstration, and demonstration purposes, I've got 80 grit on this. If I want to go up in higher grits, you've got that option. One of the things that I'm talking to Trent about getting these multiples is so that way I can have them set up to where I've got multiple different grits ready to go and I can just swap them out. So I was using your standard little live center. So unfortunately with this, with having a hole bored in it, this shoulder is going to butt up against here and it's going to cause a ring, and we don't want that. So I'm going to use the more precise tapered tail center or live center and get that in there, and then we'll be able to do all of the rest of our stuff with that. So advance the quill so it seats, and then we're going to start spinning this, and we're going to advance the quill in place so it gets there, tighten everything up. And so at this point, if we're ready to start sanding, we can start and we can do this portion, this 2.5, 3 inches or so on the lathe while it's turning. And so that's what we're going to do. Yes, ma'am. So good question. Why did I have the lathe running while I put the tailstock in there? That's out of habit. I picked it up at either Yen Moreau's class or Trent's class that I taught. The advantage is if you're turning it, it helps to center if your tailstock is slightly off or if this is not fully seated. Instead of just going and wrenching it in place, you can also put undue pressure on your piece. So does that answer your question there, Alex? Yep. Like I said, I picked it up.
We learned that from Jan, and it's amazing how much better a lot of pieces center.
Yes. Yep. So thank you, Chris, because you took that same class. And so I picked it up at Yen's class, and it just makes so much sense because as you're advancing your live center in there, it just helps to align that hole. If there's any imperfections, it does it. Because if you're tightening this and this is in there crooked or your tailstock gets off, you're going to put unnecessary pressures on that piece. So that's, like I said, I picked it up, and that's something I've done since. And it just helps with better alignment because I've got just the slightest little bit. I mean, we're talking less than a millimeter. I mean, it's pretty round still. And so while this is spinning, we're going to get our tool. So you can use a 2-inch sanding drum or a 2-inch disc with a die grinder on this. I like using this tool. So the advantage of this is that if your paper runs out and wears out, you can rip a section off and then you got fresh sandpaper to use. And so I'm staying clear enough away from the tail, the live center, and just enough to clean it. And so I could do a lot better with that, but because we don't have a dust collection, I don't want to be sanding and getting dust everywhere. So as far as this goes, so you can use this tool on here to go back and forth on it. It's really nice because you can rotate your tool. You can go with the Dremel back and forth, and you can rock your piece back and forth, and it keeps it as round as possible. You can use a 2-inch. But where this tool shines is right here in this corner. And so the fact that this corner is pretty well done, I'm not even going to bother. Tool marks, it's just sanding at that point. But like I said earlier, because you're talking, I mean, that's a 2.5-inch width, tapering down to inch or so. A lot easier with a hand sander of some kind, as opposed to a whole bowl. And so you can just rock your piece back and forth while it's still mounted in the lathe powered down, and then finish it up. And so I'm happy with how this has turned out. You know, another 30 minutes worth of sanding, and then it's going to be pretty well good to go. So this tool,
So, Josh,
Yes, sir.
After you're done sanding, you'll just take that off and use the bandsaw to cut your base?
No, I'm actually going to use my parting tool.
Okay, so you are going to part it off.
Yes, I'm going to part it off. So I'll get my tool rest there, get it situated. This is the Robert Sorby 2mm 1/8, and it's got a mill very similar to the D-Way beating tools. And I really like this as a parting tool. The 1/8 gives you a lot of flexibility to get in there and get a nice clean cut. There are other parting tools on the market. A lot of them are wider. So while this gets you a real clean cut, anything much more wonkier than this, and it's going to be a lot more of a delicate process, because you are going so thin, but you just want to get in there, the groove down, and you want to just part that off nicely. But let me take this sanding bit out and pass it around to show you folks, because this is slicker than snot. So I use electrical tape, and you can use whatever grit sandpaper that you want. And so the mandrel itself is very short. And so you have, right now I've got about 1.5 inches. And so the more you use this, your tip is going to start to fray. And so taking a pair of scissors and just snipping that tip off allows you to get a fresh edge on that. And so this is about a 2-inch section by whatever a quarter sheet is wide, and this will last quite a bit. So go ahead and just pass that bit around. And using that bit for here is a lifesaver. I could use a standard drum that Dremel makes, but you're missing out on your finer grits. And so this piece I turned earlier today. This one I got to 220 or 240, whatever it was. And so I'm going to water pop this just to raise the grain, and I'm going to use some 320 and just lightly hit it with sandpaper by hand, and this is going to be ready to go. So you could hypothetically use a bandsaw to cut this off. As wonky as my bandsaw cuts are, and the fact that, you know, cutting a log on the bandsaw is not the best thing to do, having a jig to do that saves many saw blades. Beth and I have busted a blade or two. But using the parting tool allows you to get it and get that parted off and get a nice perpendicular cut to it. And then, so we're going to get ready. We're going to adjust the tool rest in place and make sure we're not getting anything.
Quick question on that, Josh.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to keep interrupting. So you're going to go right into that bark. Do you do anything to kind of pre-cut that bark where you're coming in, or will the parting tool cut it plainly?
It'll cut nicely, as nice as it has already. I do got a hunk of bark that chipped off here with a little bit of actual wood. But yeah, I'm just going to get the tool, and we're going to back this up. So this has a bevel on it, and this is your fluted portion. So to sharpen this, you just hit this short bevel, and then they've got HSS printed on it. So if you have any question as far as what side goes up, just put the HSS like you're reading it. And so I'm just going to come in here, and I'm going to go probably just about 3/8, half inch above where my shoulder is for my tenon, and I'm just going to walk that down. And I'm going to show you how I started, but I'm not going to make that cut all the way through, because I will end up taking this, putting it on my lathe, and I will get this all sanded up before finishing it, before I completely remove it and have to sand everything by hand. I could, but having it on the chuck still, and I'm not going to be turning it, is nice to where I can get those lines cleaned up. Yes, I am. And so the reason being is because this parting tool has a groove milled into it. And so it's acting like a very small beating tool. And so it's got two tiny little knives that go in. And so that acts as your tiny little notch that you would with a skew. So, yes, Margaret.
If this was green wood at this point, would you just set it aside and let it dry so you could finish sanding it and then part it off? Or do you roughly sand it while it's green and then come back to it? Or
So on all the pieces I've done, I have parted it off, wrapped it up in a bath towel, set it in a cardboard box, and just check it periodically, like every week, 2 weeks, swapping out towels and doing it that route. I could leave the tenant on, and if I wanted to, I could part it off at the end. The problem, depending on the wood that you are using, the species, if you get a lot of twisting and turning, which can happen, you're not going to have it between centers. And so it's going to be almost a hindrance to try and put that back, because if you have this and you have it as you would if you were turning something multi-axis, that's going to be even more so. You could try it if you have a wood that's going to warp very minimally. I would just as soon just part it right off while I've got everything as straight as possible without running any risk of it warping on me and not being able to put it between two centers.
And then just hand sand it later?
So actually what I'm going to do just a minimal cut. And like I said, I'm not going to go all the way through. But then what I do after this, I take my pole saw. Once I get that cut down, take my pole saw and I get it. And so you've got that little nub on the bottom side. And so will take this piece. I took this piece after I parted it off. I took it to our table sander, just a 3 or 4 inch wide belt sander, and just hit that. And then just as best as I can, keeping it vertical, get everything sanded. And so this is still rough from earlier. After that, then I'll take finer grits on like my 2-inch with my angle die grinder and just go nice and progressively higher and higher, and then get a nice finish on that bottom.
But all year sanding along the grain? Are you doing that when it's still green, or do you let it dry and come back and hand sand it?
Yep. So I will do almost everything, whether it's green or dry, right now. If this was green, I would get this all sanded. I would part it off, wrap it up. This is dry, so I'm going to get this. I'm going to part this off. I'm going to sand that nub down on my belt sander. And then I'm going to, along with this one, I'm going to work up my grits. This one, I've got a water pop, so that's the only last step. I went to 220, 240, and then, so I'm going to water pop that just to raise the grain, and then I'm just going to by hand sand it. And so I do all my green turning, I sand while it's still on the lathe, because once it warps, it's so much of a pain. So if I need to, like I've got 2 small little hollow forms, cottonwood burls that I turn green, let them dry, and they warped. And so I've got them all sanded on the outside. So all I need to do is just hit it by hand. And so I do all my sanding before I am done with it, aside from just touch up. And so on this, we're going to back the tool rest up just a little bit because of that bevel. We want to be on the straight portion of the tool itself. And then we're going to just bump that. Yeah, 430. We went down a little bit. So we're just going to go nice and easy like you would a beating tool. Get one going, go off to the side of it. Recess it and then go back and forth. And that's all that we're going to do. We're all the way through. We're going to go a little bit more just to go past the bark on that shorter side. And just walk it back and forth until you get progressively shorter, and then at that point use my pull saw, get rid of the tool rest and the banjo out of the way, and just keep cutting, turning the piece, cut until it pops off. Release your tension on your tailstock, and then take this piece over to the belt sander, sand it flush on the bottom, and go progressively up. And so, yeah, we're sitting at 8:30. So this
Thanks.
would take about another half hour, but it's all sanding. So
We don't need the sanding.
what do I finish it with? So my wife and I at that on that online symposium back in February of 23, there was a demonstrator who had ran through the gamut of all the different kinds of finishes. And so what Beth and I got from that, for a decorative piece or a piece, if you're going to have a bowl as a catch-all, we like to use lacquer. I use Minwax spray lacquer for food safe. I believe it was Pat Scott. Was he the one that did the bowl,
The plates?
the plates?
Yeah.
Okay, so he suggested Odie's oil. We've started to incorporate that into some of our food safe pieces, but previously we've just done a walrus oil. And so those are the two finishes. And the reason that we do those two finishes and what we got from that demonstration was ease of reapplication. If this gets chewed up by a dog and our client calls us or the kids scratch it, the finish is messed up, what do? I can walk that person through, get some sandpaper, scuff it up, go to Walmart, Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever store of your flavor, and go get Minwax. Okay, what sheen does it have? Is it bright and shiny, or is it a duller finish? Okay, get your satin finish or your gloss finish. So by putting a lacquer finish on our decorative pieces, it's that ease of reapplication for our client, because this is what Beth and I do full time. We go to art shows all over and we sell our stuff. And so that's what we use on it. And so I use just the aerosol can. Once it's not frigid cold in our shop, I'm going to be looking at the can itself of brush on. I'm going to be diluting that down with lacquer thinner and running that through my airbrush. So right now we're kind of way too cold to be applying that. But yep, Minwax spray lacquer. It's one of the best coatings that we have found for our decorative pieces. There's a lot of other coatings out there. And Tom, I believe you're the go-to guy for finishes, aren't you?
I've played around with different stuff. The finish that I use mostly is a blend of total polyurethane and some metal spirits to finish.
Yeah, my wife and I are going to have to chat with you a little bit more extensively down the road and pick your brain. But yeah, so, as I mentioned, this, I'm going to clean it up just a little bit on the lathe still, which is why I chose not to go all the way through here with my parting tool. But then get it sanded up, to whatever grit you're comfortable with, and then put a lacquer finish on it. So some people, Paul Russell, yes. Yep, so Paul Russell, on some of his pieces, he will do a finish on his turn portion and he will mask off that live edge. It's whatever you're comfortable with. I just spray the entire whole thing. So
Okay, Josh.
That's it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good job.
thank you, Chris.
So if you are on the first part of the alphabet, typically A through